Evolution FM. Uplift yourself to uplift others. It's time to evolve. What's up, everybody? Welcome to Evolution.fm. We have a great episode today. My good friend and amazing entrepreneur, Dylan Beynon, who is the CEO and founder of Mindbloom, is coming onto the show. Mindbloom, just to give you some quick background, is really a pioneer in the psychedelic medicine and therapy space. And Dylan is actually the friend who introduced me to the world of psychedelics a little over 3 years ago. And the experience that I had was absolutely profound. And it completely opened up my perspective of how to think about these substances, truly the nature of reality. And over the past few years, we're really beginning to see these substances become mainstream. And Mindbloom is a big part of that shift in terms of how people are addressing mental illness, behavioral challenges, and even physical challenges. And so this episode will definitely provide a primer on the topic, but this episode is really an opportunity for me to go deep on the questions that I have about the evolution of psychedelic medicine, how we should be thinking about it, where we see this going in the next 5 to 10 years. And honestly, it's very, very exciting. Let's hear from Dylan Beynon. Dylan, what's up, my man?
What's going on, Scott?
I've actually been trying to recommend Mindbloom to some of my family members, as you know, because I'm so excited about the work that you guys are doing and the service that you're making available to people. Obviously, I've been following you guys from the very beginning, but I think a lot of people that are listening right now maybe have no idea what Mindbloom is, and what you guys are trying to do. So let's just contextualize the conversation as a starting point.
Mindbloom is a mental health and well-being brand, helping people achieve life-changing clinical and personal breakthroughs with at-home psychedelic therapy. The first medicine and treatment that our platform supports is ketamine therapy. We have like a product that's alchemizing both the psychedelic medication, but also psychiatric care from psychiatric clinicians, coaches, we call psychedelic guides, and a lot of different content and meditations and programs through like a Headspace for psychedelic therapy app into this really transformational experience that, because it's delivered at home, costs a lot less and is a lot more convenient for people to receive. Quick question for you. When you have those conversations with your family members, How do those go?
The number one thing that people say is, I'm afraid.
Mm-hmm.
The interesting thing that I think about it, and I want to get your response to what you say to people that say that is, I mean, what's scarier, like continuing to perpetuate a reality that is not one that you're excited about and doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results, or trying something that's literally being used by the top doctors in the world to drive change?
A couple directions to go. And we literally just had our first ever in real life company retreat at Mindbloom. The company's been around for 2.5, 3 years now, which was absolutely epic, very magical. One topic of conversation we had was a bit philosophical in nature that came up spontaneously, was this idea of like, can you only help people who have decided that they are ready to make a change and that they deeply want to make a change? And that's most of our clients in Mindbloom. They come to Mindbloom because they have struggled with anxiety, depression, or other things around their mental health and well-being for 10, 20, 30 years. Our median clients like over 40 years old. Or is there an ability or a mechanism where we can help people realize that they have an issue, a problem, that they're stuck, that there's a solution, and help build the activation energy to go out and seek that change? And you wonder, like, maybe there's even like a step function, right? Maybe somebody goes to Tony Robbins because they're interested, a friend brings them, and that helps increase that activation energy and motivation to then take a massive step forward. In some ways, even in Mindbloom, we think about like success isn't just driving real clinical outcomes for anxiety or depression, or helping people feel like they are able to create these new, healthier habits or break bad habits, but maybe like one of the big brand promises is, leaving Mindbloom with this feeling of massive sort of inspiration and clarity. You're beginning your journey. I think a lot of people come to Mindbloom or Burning Man or Tony Robbins or any sort of other transformational product or community or group thinking that will be like the end of the journey, but it's actually successful. That's like the beginning of the journey, the first step.
To me, I'm glad that we're kind of looking at both vectors because I think meditation is a great parallel, right? You have people that started meditation like me because they woke up one day and they had a bald spot on their beard the size of a quarter and they developed alopecia from being so stressed out. And it's like, you need to change or something bad is going to happen. Or there's people that are like, hey, I've heard that this makes me more performant. And so I'm going to do this to try to unlock some new level of wisdom or insight or peace or whatever it is. And so, there's clearly kind of both markets, but I think what I perceive today, at least in terms of like an initial beachhead, is the people that are willing to try something kind of as new age and different and outside their comfort zone are like the people that have tried everything else and nothing has worked. Mm-hmm. I think there's just a higher percentage of people that are like that versus like someone following Dave Asprey and Tim Ferriss and is like, oh, cool, this is going to make me more creative. Like, although that certainly exists from a society perspective, it's the first group that I think really, really where the focus needs to be.
You come from a B2B SaaS background. Like, what's a platitude? Like, you can only sell something if it's somebody's like top 3 burning pain point. I think this is similar for a lot of people. If something's this new, this different, this scary, it really does need to solve like a top 3 burning pain point. Unfortunately for Mindbloom, but unfortunately for the world, hopefully one day we can eliminate the need for ourselves, is it's mental health and well-being and mental anguish, addiction, depression, anxiety is a top 3 burning pain point for a startling amount of people.
Yeah. And the other thing that I think is crazy to think about, it's also like at the individual level, it's a huge problem. At the societal level, just what it means for our effectiveness as a country in terms of the general welfare of people, of GDP, of production, of creating things in the world, of positive change. Like, I don't know if it was you that told me this, but like the amount of money that we spend a year, or just like the cost on GDP, which by the way, I don't really give a shit about this stuff. Like, I don't want people to think I'm
you don't care about total factor productivity? Matters.
It just, well, to me, it's a proxy for general welfare of a large group of people. And I don't know that people recognize like the impact that it has on like the economy, on the country, on all of these things, which all serve the general welfare of the nation state.
Sure. Well, here's one way to think about it. I think work has sort of become this almost bastardized concept where our ancestors, like what you worked on, whether it was like hunting for the group, creating a pot, taking care of the kids, cooking, and that's your contribution back to the tribe, right? Like that's like literally like what you're doing to help those around you as social animals, like interact with each other and thrive and survive and reproduce and go on to like create something meaningful together. I think for a lot of people, they're divorced from that sense of connection to work. And if you can't work, if you're disabled, you're really divorced from that sense of meaning, purpose, connection, and fulfillment from work. Depression is the number 1 cause of disability worldwide. Literally, people's mental anguish is the number 1 issue preventing people from being able to contribute to the labor marketplace and to, connect to that sense of contribution back to the tribe. Suicide is the 2nd leading cause of death for people under 35. It's the 4th leading cause of death for people 35 to 55. These massive problems. And it has these second order consequences, as you pointed out, to their friends, family, community, and the work that they can do in the world.
I totally agree. One question I had for you is you mentioned people look at something like a Mindbloom or an ayahuasca and they're like, oh yeah, like I'm going to do it and that's it. I'm going to be healed. But really that's just kind of where the work starts. And I see this with a lot of different people that kind of have these peak experiences where, and you could take going to Tony Robbins as a parallel. You go, you're fired up, you feel great, you have all these revelation, you're excited. And then eventually that kind of glow wears off and you're just back into the patterns. How does something like at the chemical level, ketamine, psychedelics, how does it help with that? And then what do you think, like from an integration standpoint, how are you guys approaching this? Because it seems like that's the real hard nut to crack.
Mm-hmm. So ketamine, along with other psychedelics like psilocybin, LSD, seem to, based on neuroimaging studies, upregulate and secrete this protein called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF. BDNF is often thought of as like fertilizer for the brain or human growth hormone, but for the brain. It can create this state of synaptogenesis where neurons or brain cells are more easily able to create connections between other neurons. One way to think about it, if you've had a psychedelic experience, is you have this state of transient hypofrontality where essentially your prefrontal cortex, like your thinking part of the brain, gets dimmed down. But you have this state of synaptogenesis where all of a sudden you're making these new connections. That's why you can simultaneously feel really creative. Your lateral thinking is increased, but also really stupid. Your processing power is decreased, or your linear thinking. You like can't do arithmetic, but you're having all these creative breakthroughs about, your life or philosophy or, the meaning of life that somehow seem to persist and stick sometimes. When you take ketamine and other psychedelics as well, this BDNF upregulation can happen for like 3 to 14 days afterwards. It is right now the leading theory for why ketamine has these incredible rapid antidepressant effects, even if you don't do any of this preparation and integration work. Just this state of BDNF being secreted creates this opportunity for the brain to create healthier brain patterns and to get out of unhealthy brain patterns that are in like the default mode network, or the ones that are sort of just running in the background all the time. They're sort of the unhealthy ruminative programs that, haven't been pruned. So that's one of the reasons that, it seems that these medicines have these really transformational effects for people. Like it's actually creating the sort of pharmacokinetic or neurochemical brain state where people can more easily create new behaviors, get out of bad behaviors, and totally clean up all these bad subroutines running in their brain.
I love just to pause on that real quick. I love the metaphor that I think I heard with Michael Pollan and Tim Ferriss, where it's like a ski mountain, right? Where there's those parts of the mountain that they just get skied on over and over again. And so the track becomes really, really hard. And that's like your brain. And so when you introduce one of these substances that all of a sudden enhances the connectivity, it's like scrambling the snow. Like all of a sudden those tracks are gone, right? There's opportunities for new tracks and new patterns and new thoughts and new ways to just understand situations and how you react that previously were hard.
Yeah. And neuroimaging studies in the brains of addicts. So people who have really sort of carved those grooves that you're talking about in their dopamine channels for, gambling, porn, stimulants that are, dopamine agonists, like could be like Adderall or cocaine. You like literally see grooves in the brain where it's just carved these pathways over and over and over again. Yeah, and that's what psychedelics and BDNF, which you can also get from things like high intensity interval training exercise and fasting, and I think some certain foods even can help do, which is shake up the snow globe or have the snow fall over those tracks so that you can carve them fresh.
This is really helpful information. So you have 3 to 14 days where your brain's getting fertilizer. It's getting some type of enhancement. What is the leading research or general best practice to make that stick?
There are a few different ways that people think about it. So our protocols at Mindbloom have been built by some of the leaders in psychedelic research and psychiatric care, both in sort of vanilla psychiatry and ketamine therapy. Our science director who led the charge building early protocols is a principal investigator with MAPS on the MDMA clinical trials, did some like the first ketamine for depression studies, the landmark psilocybin for cancer anxiety study, which I think Michael Pollan talks about a lot. And so he brought sort of his viewpoints in. And one of the ways that we sort of have distilled it at Mindbloom to kind of make it clear and digestible for people is that there are 3 phases of integration. The first phase is making sense of the experience. Some people who provide ketamine therapy might just like give people an injection of it in the hospital room, send them on their way. But the research seems to show pretty clearly that what you do before, during, and after an experience dramatically affects the clinical outcome. And how you, as you put out, integrate the experience really matters. So it's making sense of the experience, integrating or interpreting the experience, and then actioning the experience. So for making sense of the experience, there are a few different things you can do. You can journal right after the experience. It's actually incredibly powerful, especially if you do something like ketamine that can act on your glutamate system, which encodes memory. So by journaling right after the experience for people, it can be like grabbing like a ball of yarn and then like pulling on that yarn and coalescing it into an entire ball of yarn so that you have something concrete and tangible that doesn't just sort of, like blow away in the wind. Other things you can do to make sense of the experience. Sometimes you have like a therapist or a facilitator, provider help you sort of bucket the experience into different categories around how it felt or what came up cognitively so that people can have something to work with, since it's often really sort of ineffable and indescribable. Once someone has sort of taken all of these, sensations, so, they could be hallucinations or visual phenomenon or auditory phenomenon or, feelings, and sort of started to, put them in their places and their buckets. The next step is to interpret the experience. And so that's where somebody might work with a guide at Mindbloom or psychedelic therapist or a shaman or some sort of counselor or provider or even just a peer to really begin talking through like what the experience means. There are a lot of different sort of philosophies or methodologies here. So there's stuff like Hakomi integration practice. There's I think it's called parts therapy, family parts therapy. But really working with somebody to, take these cognitive insights that came up that can be very messy and start to figure out what to do with them. Then the third bucket is actioning the experience. So, you have this fertilized brain state, you have this uplifted emotional state, whether it's from ketamine or psilocybin or LSD or even MDMA, and you ostensibly have this clarity on changes you want to make in your life, or whether it's like new habits you want to build or bad habits you want to break. And so then it's creating a plan to actually go through the process of following through on those things to get them to stick. And I think we're still like really early in how to build platforms or protocols or methodologies to help people actually change their behavior. Like we know behavioral change is one of the trickiest, most challenging parts of life. Really, really hard to change our own behavior. It's like near impossible to help someone change their behavior. Psychedelics are this neuroplastic agents that put people in this brain state to change their behavior and give them, insights on what to change. One of the things that I'm really excited about is with Mindbloom is, building the behavioral change platform where we're figuring out how to help people actually drive long-term behavioral change. It's one of the reasons that we have psychiatric clinicians and coaches, but don't have talk therapists on staff. I think a lot of talk therapists are trained a little bit more in, looking at trauma and helping people get to those insights, but less about keeping people accountable to actual clear steps like a coach might. But yeah, that's how I think about the three different steps into actually taking these experiences, making sense of them, and putting them in practice in your life so you actually have long-term lasting impact versus just, a nice vacation.
I mean, I remember after I did my ayahuasca experience, people were saying like, try to meditate every day. How does that align to that framework?
Well, that's always an interesting one, right? I feel like one of the reasons that we're at very early of figuring out integration is you see like a lot of integration platitudes. I see like, oh, you just did psychedelics, go walk in nature every day. It's like, okay, well, what if you live in New York City? That's like, that's probably not like the right integration. Just
ground yourself.
Right. I think that the future of psychedelic medicine looks like the future of a lot of medicine, which is going to be personalized medicine, but it still isn't. I think trying to match like the right person to the right medicines with the right provider or context, whether that's, something that's more shamanic or something that's more clinical, with like the right content, that's music, meditations, preparation content, integration content, and then the right behavioral change program for them, especially based on what comes up. which is both dynamic in every experience, but also dynamic across a range of experiences and therapies in someone's mental health and well-being journal, will end up being a highly, highly personalized treatment and program for people. And I think we're still really early when it comes to that. I think we're still seeing mostly, you take some medicine, you sit with a therapist, and that's the experience. But that's not what it's going to look like in 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, I 100% agree in terms of the personalization element. And I think even our ability to kind of, from a biofeedback perspective, to understand how our body reacts to certain things, that's, increasingly becoming popular. For example, I know me and you have thought about and gone back and forth on things like HRV. Like, that wasn't a metric that you could really, A, you would even care about just because of the awareness, but B, you could cost effectively measure in the comfort of your own home 5 years ago. And I think the same is going to be true with a lot of different things that are more correlated to nervous system health, our mental and emotional states. And that's going to enable some of the personalization elements that we talk about, as well as, calibration after the experience, right? Like, you'll be able to determine, like, hey, what activities or things resonate with my system that today we might not be able to do.
So I'm really torn on this. I've maybe conflicting viewpoints. On the one hand, the biohacker in me wants to quantify, every single physical and cognitive biomarker that I can, measure it, and evaluate how different changes and interventions I'm leveraging are improving them, and be able to focus on them, right? So maybe a cognitive biomarker is like emotional valence, like how do you react emotionally to things, and how much resilience do you have, and like how do I measure that and see how sleep affects it, and see how meditation affects it, see how taking ashwagandha or phosphatidylserine affects it. On the other hand, like, do you need biomarkers to evaluate how you feel? I saw a great tweet the other day that was like, I love that magic moment 20 minutes in the morning before Whoop tells me what my HRV is, so that I can determine how I'm going to feel the rest of the day, like Schrodinger's sleep. like in a quantum state of like not knowing how you're going to feel all day until you get your Whoop score. Like, obviously that's silly. You should know how you feel based on how you feel.
I totally agree and have the same, I don't know, just internal dilemma, because I really, the more and more I go deeper on my own work that I've been doing, the more and more I believe that the mind drives the body, that the body is like a puppet of the mind. With that in mind, the information and inputs that you take are going to have a huge impact on how the body reacts. It's like, if I think something's going to be bad for me, my body's not going to react to it well. If I think that, what Whoop tells me I'm ready to train or not, it's like, oh, I'm not ready to train. Well, you're not going to be ready to train then. Like, you're not going to have a good workout then if you're thinking that before you even get into it. I think in some ways, like, I think all this data and all this stuff is really great, but I think it also sometimes has unintended consequences that actually have, perhaps a worse effect.
I got orthosomnia from sleep trackers. I tried the 8 Sleep. I tried the Oura Ring. I tried the Dream Headband electroencephalograph, and I just found myself consistently a little too obsessed with my sleep score.
Yeah, exactly.
Hours, I'm like, oh, fuck my sleep score, like waiting in the morning, checking it. And I was just ruminating on getting a good night's sleep, when really that's like a really natural activity that you shouldn't have to think about. There are reasons though that like really getting, moment to moment and more accurate clarity on these cognitive and emotional and physical biomarkers are important. From a consumer standpoint, maybe there's that trade-off, but from like a healthcare industry standpoint, it's super important, right? Like, for us to understand whether or not we're driving outcomes for patients or people based on, different treatments that we're giving them, providers we're giving them, side effects they might be having. And that is going to be, massive inflection point in the quality of medical care that we're going to be able to get people, as well as how quickly we're going to be able to, medical or non-medical care, even like supplementation, as well as getting faster and faster at getting people outcomes and learning what works and what doesn't for people. Like in psychiatry, this gold standard are these qualitative assessments called, like, say, like the PHQ-9 for depression or GAD-7 for anxiety, where we ask people some questions about how they're feeling and then give them the survey multiple times, over a course of treatment. I mean, like that feels pretty Stone Age to me. Like very,
Yeah.
very far from really being able to understand how people are feeling and how we're, driving towards improving their symptoms and essentially their quality of life over time.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. What do you think this new like age revolution, intervention, whatever you want to call it, what does it mean for traditional talk therapy?
The data around talk therapy is not great. There's different viewpoints on how effective talk therapy is. Most clinical studies seem to pop out that talk therapy is not incredibly clinically effective. It's somewhere around as clinically effective as a placebo. And that's essentially 5 to 10% of therapists are driving all the outcomes. 90 to 95% aren't driving any outcomes, which, looks about right. I mean, you work in technology, like talk therapy is sort of, it's not
It's a
like
microcosm of just things in general, right?
Exactly. It's the 80-20 rule, the Pareto principle. And the more you get something that's, call it less scientific and more art than science, you're going to see it look more like, a 90-10 rule than even an 80-20 rule. I think what's maybe the thing that's really interesting to me is like a lot of people assume, and what I'm seeing is that the future of psychedelic therapy or mental health and well-being is just going to be psychedelics sprinkled into talk therapy practices. Like, oh, we're doing talk therapy, which, we know because the mental health care crisis is only getting worse and worse, wasn't doing enough to combat it. And we need new tools. And so now we're just going to do the exact same thing, but with some psychedelics in like a pretty similar way. But I think the future of psychedelic therapy actually will look radically different than just psychedelics with talk therapy. I think we've essentially have learned how to split the atom. Like we've invented nuclear power for the mind, but we haven't yet figured out what the nuclear power plant looks like. We just know that, wow, when you split this atom, there's a lot of energy that's released. What do we do with it?
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree. But the first thing I thought of is like, wow, it's going to make all these shitty psychiatrists like seemingly be a lot better at their job. But I think the correlation is going to be off. It's going to be due to something, a completely new intervention that's happening at a chemical level. How does this jibe with spirituality? And me, I wasn't into any of this stuff. And when I had my first psychedelic experience, it just basically just completely just changed the game for me. It completely set me on a new path, a new perspective, which has changed the course of my life. And so I know that Mindbloom per se, you guys are trying to help people, have transformative experiences, mental health, performance, whatever it may be. And one of those might lead people to this spiritual path. And a lot of these kind of ecstatic states that you experience on psychedelics are ones that you can experience in different spiritual pursuits without the introduction of substances. And so I'm just curious, like, what is the relationship of the two?
Maybe we can start by defining spirituality. Spirituality is one of those tough words in that it should probably just be like crumpled up, thrown in a wastebasket, and like rethought from first principles from probably a few different angles. Because when we use the word spirituality, like whatever I have in my head, I then vibrate my vocal cords, communicate that pattern to you, you pick it up. And then what you have in your head is completely and radically different than what I had in my head. It's like not very good telepathy, right? Versus if I say chair, like we're talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
So when you say spirituality, what do you mean?
I think spirituality for me, the definition that I would have is connection to the self and connection to the truth about the reality of your existence. And so that's my definition. I would be curious how you would define it.
I just try to stay away from the word, despite the fact that I, am reading a spirituality book every every night of bed. I mean, if we're talking about like transcendent or transcendental experiences that connect people with a sense of something that's much bigger than themselves, it could be awe, it could be God, it could be meaning and purpose, but something that's way beyond their sort of everyday sort of concrete life. Then, as you know, and as most people understand, psychedelics have a propensity to induce this spiritual experience for people. I never considered myself a spiritual person. I mean, if the concept of even considering myself spiritual, in my teens, I would have laughed at myself. But through my psychedelic experiences over the past 13 years, have developed this deep sense of meaning, purpose, connection to the universe, connection to others that is deeply important to me, and that I would, call spiritual. For Mindbloom, where we're building a company where we believe that one of the three pillars of increasing access for people isn't just making it accessible through at-home treatment and more affordable, but it's also making it approachable to people. As you mentioned earlier, talking to your family, like it's scary, it's new, it's weird, it's different. And so, we've sort of eschewed common, direct to consumer marketing advice of like picking a demographic like 40-year-old women or, Gen Z, guys, and are trying to create like a 4-quadrant brand that's just psychedelic therapy for everybody, meeting you, at your level and being in a way that's really safe and efficacious and backed by science. And so one of the challenges is as people go through these experiences, they have a massive range of experiences, right? Some have these deeply, spiritual experiences, they, deeply religious experiences, others kind of very challenging experiences. And so for us, it's trying to match people to the right clinicians and the right guides that have sort of the, the background and the right, sort of, I don't know, training or the right sort of, dimensions that will connect with people. And then having a very large and deep library of practices and content and programs and music and meditations, or, call them meditations, or we'll call them like therapeutic content for people, such that as they're having these different experiences, we're able to match them to the right, content and programs for them and continue to like personalize it. But it's hard.
Yeah, it's super hard.
We're not a religious organization. In no way do we have a viewpoint that we would ever push onto somebody. People are in very raw states, and we're trying to, through like a non-directed approach, our clinicians and coaches are trying to guide people to the results that they're looking to get in their life without pushing an agenda on them. It takes a lot of training, a lot of management and oversight to make sure that we're living up to not pushing anything onto people.
The first thing I think of is like kind of like the role of a coach, where like they ask the right questions that helps you basically arrive at the conclusions and answers and insights that you already knew versus tell you what to do. Is that the way to think about a guide and what the experience might be like?
There's several reasons why the Mindbloom platform has psychiatric clinicians and coaches and not talk therapists. And that's one of them. Is coaches have this training and methodology around asking questions, understanding what someone wants to achieve, and then working with them collaboratively to develop a tailored and personalized program to achieve those results. And so in this case, of Mindblooms, we're helping people through psychedelic therapy and preparing for those experiences, having the best experiences possible, and integrating those experiences, create those change with the coach's support. Yeah, it's non-directed without like a very clear sort of philosophy. I've seen some other platforms that are popping up that have like very clear shamanic platform, very clear, like this lineage is what our platform's built around. I think that can be great too. But I've certainly been in experiences myself where I'm leaning into like drinking the Kool-Aid, but also wholesale rejecting what is being sort of forced upon me because it's not my bag.
Yeah, so that's really interesting to me, because I think more kind of what I was getting at, or what I didn't realize, is that modern medicine and ancient wisdom is slowly starting to collide. And I think it's an amazing thing. And I also think coexistence has to happen, right? There are going to be people that going to Peru and dealing with some dude in a small village is going to be no resonance there. And so they'll never have access to some of the states and insights and wisdom and healing that can occur. But maybe for some people, that's exactly what they want. And so I was unaware that there were kind of purpose-driven platforms that are legal, and maybe they're not legal, that are kind of more aligned to some of the more ancient traditions.
I've seen some pop up in the ketamine therapy world. I think the challenge is building a company is really hard. It's done it a few times now and it still feel like I barely know what I'm doing. And I think
Mm.
sometimes people who are coming from, maybe a background in shamanism have had some trouble doing it. So I've seen some who have sort of, they're germinating their platforms, haven't yet sort of broken through. But I think without a doubt, you paint the future of psychedelic therapy, and you're going to see a lot of different shapes and sizes, and people who have, their viewpoints and their structures or their lineages, and that's great. Ideally, we're getting better and better at overall helping people find, whether it's through directories or review sites, or even just platforms like ours, or building something a little broader, even if we're one platform, to help match people to the right providers, the right medications, the right programs, and the right style, which is going to be a dynamic problem because people change as they go through these experiences.
I kind of think of it like one of the quotes that I think Buddha said, where it's, he was talking about getting across a river, and you might use a canoe to get across the river, but just because you're carrying the canoe, to get across doesn't mean you need to keep carrying it. You use something until it serves you, and then you move on and you evolve until it doesn't serve you. And that's the way that I feel about a lot of this. Like, people talk to me and they're like, oh, do you want to do ayahuasca again? Or you want to do this and that? And, some people, they might need to use the tool 50 times. They might need to do an insane amount of ketamine experiences to get what they need. And some people might need to only do it once or twice, but everybody's different. And that's why I think the personalization stuff that you talk about is just very clear where this is going.
One of the things that surprised me is how frequently we get asked, like, what is the ideal number of ketamine therapy sessions per person, both by like prospective clients and existing clients, and also by, investors and press. And I've always thought it was just like such an absurd question.
Yeah. Until you don't have to come back.
Yeah, it's just like, wow, it's like, it's so fascinating that this is how we feel about medicine, that it's so precision, that when it comes to like your personal growth and development, it's just, it's a lot more dynamic than just, paving over one or two symptoms with a medication. Like, how deep do you want to go? Do you want to try other things?
Yeah.
Like, it's a very, dynamic and, variable decision to go to another Tony Robbins event or read another personal productivity book or a positive psychology book. Like, how many positive psychology books do you have to read until like you implement positive psychology? I don't know.
Yeah, no question. So my last question for you. So I have just a swath of people in my life that, again, coming back to kind of where we started, they hear about it. It sounds interesting, but they're afraid. They're scared.
Discount codes, I think, are the answer.
Well, obviously. I mean, what do you say? What advice do you have for those people? And then what advice do you have for the people that are around them that want to help those people ultimately have the transformation that they're seeking?
Let me ask you this. When people bring up the fear, which I totally understand. I mean, I was terrified of my first several psychedelic medicine experiences. So sometimes get some of the fear, like it can be really intense.
There's a stigma. It's not legal. It's like drugs are bad. And then I think the second one is like something potentially bad and irreversible could happen. It's like you hear about people having bad trips and like thinking they're Jesus for a month or something, like that type of like permanent mental
destabilization,
negative change. I think is at the core.
It was in the 60s. There was this bad meme that LSD caused like chromosomal damage. And so your children might come out missing a chromosome and be mentally stunted. In, I think, the 80s, there was a campaign, which I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but I've heard that it was funded by alcohol and tobacco. That was this, anti-marketing campaign around ecstasy puts holes in your brain, which is completely untrue. I mean, no wonder why people are afraid. Can you think of anything more horrifying, the idea that you will have irreversible brain damage from taking something like that. That's scary as can be. I think for the stigma is always really interesting. We see that a lot of people who are like, I don't want my friends and family to know. I'm worried about it. I feel guilty about it. And I think that's just going to take time. It's like, you can have them read How to Change Your Mind, have them follow or watch episodes of experts talking about it on NPR or Dr. Phil or Oprah or Goop or Netflix or CNN or whatever news sources people trust and believe in. At this point, there's probably some psychedelic content on at least one of the top channels that people are tuning into, and that might be an interesting route. But eventually, it'll just have to be people openly speaking about their transformational experiences with it. I think people trust other people like them. And so one of the things that we're doing is both publishing a lot of the clinical research and the outcomes data and safety data, because it's so safe that, significantly safer than like Prozac and Lexapro when you look at safety data. At least ketamine therapy is, and the other medications look very safe as well based on the clinical research. Yeah, and then 3 is continuing to amplify and share those client stories and clinical data and messages, and until people look around and have see enough people that they know and trust who have had, these transformational experiences. I think it's just an adoption curve there.
No, I agree. And I do think the human element is really important, right? And I just think about like our conversation. It's like the fact that Johns Hopkins has published this research and it's awesome, but for a 70-year-old person in your family, like that just isn't going to resonate as much as like someone like themselves who's going through something similar, being able to overcome that and seeing that in an emotional way.
It's the adoption curve, right? There's like a small percentage of people who are the innovators who just love new stuff and they're out on the bleeding edge, like not the cutting edge, the bleeding edge. Like it's broken when they're using it. And then you have the early adopters who come in and they like early products and they're ahead of the game. And then the early majority, the late majority, and the laggards who, get pulled kicking and screaming into the present. I think one of the things that surprised me is that I think this adoption curve in psychedelics is we're moving through it significantly faster than I could have ever anticipated. And the reason is because people are in so much pain, and because I think these have been around for a long time, because this is being driven, not just by sort of maybe like cannabis, but people who wanted cannabis to be legal, consumers and businesses, but by like scientists and thought leaders and authors and people who are really respected, who believe in this, who are massively accelerating how much credibility and social proof there is in psychedelics, like Tim Ferriss and Michael Pollan. So I think it's happening a lot faster, but I'm still afraid to get LASIK. I'm probably going to do it in the next 9 months. My wife is doing it next week, letting her go first. So someone had to be the first person to get LASIK. That was a brave mofo, right?
Space travel, man. Think about that.
Yeah, right. Just strap me up and launch me into space as the first person. So I think it takes time, and it just takes people continuing to talk about it publicly, to have the courage to share their experiences, which I think increasingly people are, not just willing to do, but excited to do, because the stigma is dropping. And, the more incredible client stories, the more research, the more data, and the more ubiquitous this becomes, the more people will be comfortable, and that fear element will, subside.
Well, I look forward to that. I look forward to that period. And I think it's a lot sooner than we think. But thanks, man. This was really fun. This was awesome. I always love your perspective and insight. I think for a lot of people that are kind of on edge of the fence here and thinking about this will be a really valuable conversation. We got to give the Mindbloom plug. As you know, you got the .com now, right?
Oh yeah, mindbloom.com.
At one point you were a .co guy, but you've come up in the world, I guess. As a Mindbloom, someone who's tried it myself, can't say enough good things. So everybody go check it out if anything that we talked about sounds exciting. Thanks again, Dylan.
It was a blast, Scott. Great to chat as always.